Yes, yes. So welcome everyone to this week's Lunch and Learn. We're glad that you joined us again. As you know, Michelle and I have switched things up over the last couple of weeks to use this time to create a space to have discussions that serve us best during this time. There's, just so much of what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the current situation of crisis that we have with quarantine and everything in our country, in our world, really, that we've switched up our topics. And we were able to have a discussion this week with two trauma experts, Susan Greif and Kai Marie Torrence. And wave ladies for us, please. We're going to introduce them in a minute. You can see them on your screen. Yeah, so we're going to have a conversation today about ancestral trauma and post-traumatic growth. And so much to talk about in this hour, so let's just dig right in. I'm going to kick us off with just explaining a bit of what makes up trauma, and then we'll pass it over to Michelle for her to start off with some questions for our guests and an introduction of them so that you know more about them. So what is trauma? We're experiencing it right now. Trauma, emotional and psychological trauma, is the result of an extraordinarily stressful event that shatters your sense of security, making you feel helpless or that you're living in a dangerous world. There are three main types of trauma, and I think you'll see as Susan and Kai will be discussing trauma from the perspectives of two different cultures. You'll see the differences in kind of the trauma, but also the foundational similarities in trauma and what we can, how we can move through trauma and not get stuck in it so that we can get past challenging times like this. Of course, we have to say we are not doctors, and this is just what we're offering from our own areas of expertise, but we hope that it will be helpful for you. So the three types of trauma are: one, acute trauma. Acute trauma results from a single incident. And then we've got chronic trauma, which is repeated and prolonged, such as domestic violence or abuse. And then we have complex trauma, and complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often invasive and interpersonal in nature. And a lot of times complex trauma is not always understood by people outside of the person experiencing or the culture or race experiencing the trauma. And so with that, just to give you just a definition of trauma, now we're going to talk about ancestral trauma and epigenetics and how this is all passed down to us and what we can do so that we don't feel helpless. And so with that, I'll pass it over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Amber. So yeah, we have Kai and Susan, our subject matter experts, who are really going to provide us a lot of insights around generational and ancestral trauma. So let me share a bit about who they are. So Kai Marie has spent the last 7 years on a personal healing journey. Through implementing her tailored transformational journey of healing and self-discover program and the use of meditation and yoga, Kai has worked to address her negative patterns of behavior and change the direction of her life. Her healing journey led her to enter the field of wellness and to launch her passion project, Kai Marie. Kai Marie provides life experience coaching, restorative yoga, therapeutic yoga services for people who are seeking a personal transformation. Kai also raises awareness of historical and generational trauma through her podcast, The Healing Element. So we're going to be hearing a lot more about that. Susan, welcome, Susan. She interprets her clients' drawings to help them see their subconscious and notice where they hold their ancestral trauma. Her goal is to help her clients release old stuck energies that keep them from feeling powerless, paralyzed, panicked, and in pain. And then she offers her creative, multidisciplinary strategies to help them take action and make shifts in their life. As a daughter of Holocaust survivors, Susan specializes in working with daughters of Holocaust survivors like herself. Additionally, she works with women of domestic violence, trauma victims, and women in transition. She offers one-on-one coaching, couples, private workshops, parent-child workshops, as well as online workshops and corporate workshops and retreats. So we are in store for a lot of good learning and insights by our special guests. So ladies, to kick us off, we have a question. So can Each of you, I'm going to start with you, Kai. Can you explain what ancestral/generational trauma is? And then feel free, Susan, on the back end to kind of add and complement what Kai has offered.
Sure. And so I wanted to say thanks so much, Michele and Amber, for creating this space and for having this conversation, and also for Susan as well. I'm looking forward to it. So for as far as ancestral trauma, it's trauma that is passed on through a lineage, as I like to say. And so, for example, for the experience of many African Americans that are in this country, many of them, or many of us, have had the same type of experience, like this shared experience in which with slavery, Jim Crow, and we kind of know the story of how that goes. And so it's this shared experience that we all have had. And even though it may have been some differences, but for the most part, it is something that we have all experienced together and we can relate in that way. And so out of that, basically, we have, since we've experienced this trauma, we've all experienced this trauma, what this does, it allows us to begin to connect due to the trauma, but also for us to begin to just start to have the conversation as far as the different experiences that we've had. And so, I mean, there is the science to it with epigenetics, but I won't get into that part of it. But I think that it's just basically the shared experience that we have. And it's important for us to start to have a dialogue about it so that we can begin the healing process.
Susan.
Yes, yes, ancestry, of course. As a daughter of survivors, yes, we also had many years of memories of, again, also slavery and inquisitions and Holocaust. So it does affect us as well. So because I am a daughter of Holocaust survivors, I also work with daughters of Holocaust survivors and deal with their generational trauma. And as Kai was saying before, there is the epigenetics. And there is, you know, that's epigenetics is the nature part, and there's also the nurture part. And I think it's important for us to understand both. We used to believe that our DNA, you know, we are who we are and there's no change. But over the past several years, they've learned about epigenetics. And epigenetics is a mark that is put on your gene to switch things on and switch things off. So for instance, if you are in a hostile environment, your cortisol level, you know, spikes high and you learn how to deal with the stress at hand. But in order to survive, we develop these little markers that we get from, you know, we get from their environment to say, okay, this is how you're going to survive. I'm going to turn this off or on. So it has to do with your stress, let's just say, your stress level. So it turns it off. So what happens is eventually that little cap goes on your genome, and through meiosis, it gets passed down to the next generation. So even though our parents had to deal with the stress environment, it does get passed on, and we learn how to deal with stress in that way. And it makes it difficult for us to deal with the stress because we're not in that environment that they were in, let's just say. And there's also the nurturing. How are we raised? The culture, the social culture, and economics ways, the belief system, that's also passed on from generation to generation. What we do today is because we learned from our parents how to do it. So it really, you know, this, and I think we're all becoming more aware in this generation. And I think this generation, if we become aware and we're willing to have these dialogues and have conversations and challenge our cultural beliefs, then we can heal ourselves. And this is why I felt, you know, this conversation was very important to be held. So me as a white person can understand what women of color or people of color are going through at this moment. It sparked an interest and a need to educate myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to throw this out to which of you care to address it. How does ancestral trauma show up, and what should we then begin to be aware or conscious of?
Sure. I mean, I think ancestral trauma can show up in different ways. Again, speaking for the African American community, it can show up in how we speak to each other, how we rear our children. All of that is what's passed on from the previous generation. And when you think about the different traumas that we experience, I mean, even now recently we see, I think there's 4 cases right now of Black men who have been found lynched in this country. And so seeing that again for us right now in 2020, that can be a trigger, even though we were not, you know, we may have not seen it personally during a particular era, but even hearing it now and seeing this now and these same stories, that can definitely be a trigger. And so how it shows up in communities, I mean, you can look at the African American community, you can see as far as where we are economically, and although there are other factors that contribute to that, but it's, you know, out of such a horrific start, right, to our place in this country, to still try to find the ability to have a family, raise a family, provide stability for a family, for a community, under great duress, under chronic stress. And so when you're looking at the trauma piece of that, so what could come out of that? You know, how a mother can relate to her daughter growing up, you know, in slavery. We're not so far removed from slavery. And so just think about a mother who was enslaved, and how was she able to connect to her children, knowing that at any point her children could be sold away? How would she be able to connect with the man that she loves, knowing that he could be sold away? And so all of those experiences that our ancestors went through, that definitely has a lasting impact on us and our ability to connect with each other as a community, how we speak to each other, how we speak to our children, how we speak to our spouse, our loved ones. So those are some different ways that it can show up. And I think that, again, platforms like this are really important, because what happens a lot of times, we just look at the outcomes and we don't dig deeper to see, okay, what's the root cause? You know, why is getting a switch to discipline my child? Why do we do that? Where does that come from? Is that something that's necessary? And not saying that, that you shouldn't do that. You know, that's, every parent can decide how they want to discipline their child. But some of these things we just have to start to take a deeper look at and see, is any of our current behavior stemming from what we went through? And then once we start to take a look at that, do some reflection in our own internal work, then we can start the process to begin to heal and say, you know, we can start to change some things. Maybe it's even changing the diet. When you look at the diet of the fried foods in many of our African American communities, sometimes it can show up at that, not eating healthy. So there's different ways that it can show up. And because we're all different, it shows up differently. So I think it just goes back to, again, to having those conversations and beginning to really know our history and understanding that, yes, you know, we all heard of Jim Crow and segregation, but really understanding the emotional and mental impact that also had on us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I agree.
Is there anything you want to add? Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Susan. Susan, address that, please.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. I have to agree, I think, but we have to also understand there's a lot of inheritance of stress, anxiety, depression. It could be anger. There could be frustration. There could be hypervigilant and fearful of somebody's watching over you or somebody's behind you. For me, it could be, you know, frugality, because we come from nothing, right? We had nothing. So I'm sure that might be something as well, saving for the future. Always believing that it could happen again. So there is always that fear, and that is, people can't sleep at night, right? The nightmares, recurring nightmares, even if it wasn't their own trauma, they have reoccurring nightmares of what could happen in their life.
Yeah, and can I just add to Susan's point, if that's okay? Because you brought up a good point as far as the savings, and I think many times, and this is, again, generally speaking, in the African American community, many times because it was just kind of like everyone's in survival mode, right? We came out of, much of our culture and our belief system is a response to traumas that occurred. And so when we think about savings, many times that may not be a thought, because we're just trying to get through the day. So this kind of long-term thinking for some of our people in our community could be like a different type of concept, because we're just trying to make it through the day. And it's like, you know, we can't worry about really what's going to happen 5 years from now. How many of us have heard people say, listen, I'm just trying to get through today, and then tomorrow I'll worry about tomorrow. And so now beginning to, as we start to have more conversations about people in our community investing, long-term investing, like this long-term planning, many of these are new concepts. And there have been times we have definitely saved money, but also we know historically what has happened when we put our money into different banking institutions, what would happen. And so there's also this kind of fear of, if I do, you know, put my money into a banking to save, to put money aside, many a times the money that we had, you know, that would be confiscated. And so again, that adds to what Susan has said, like that stress, that hypervigilance of who can I trust? Can I trust this government? Can I trust this country in which I live, because of continuous trauma that occurs within our community?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Amber, there was something you wanted to make reference to?
It's just, you know, as I hear us having this discussion and think about even the preparation that we did for this before we were on with everyone, I just want to point out a couple of things. One, that it's so interesting to hear Susan, you address, and Kai, you address some of the things that we're characterized in our cultures as of Jewish people and money and being frugal, or Black people and hypervigilance. These things that we are represented by are actually results of our trauma and our stress that comes from the trauma. And I think that it's very important. A part of the reason that we wanted to have this discussion today is to point out some of these things so that we can have compassion for ourselves and understand how to better move forward. The symptoms of trauma, shock and denial and hypervigilance, hyperarousal, these things that we get characterized as, or we get prejudged to be these type of ways, are shame triggers for us in a lot of situations. And so they trigger our some of us, not everyone, but some of us will have shame around these things and not really recognizing why they are the way they are, and to be able to accept them and then to not have them be something that we're ashamed of, but something that actually lends to our resilience and understanding that the reason that our body responds in these ways is to keep us alive, is to have us cope so that we can keep moving forward. And so when we recognize that, I think that we're able to have more compassion for ourselves and others, and then start to think of a way forward. And so we're going to talk about that as we continue on in the conversation with post-traumatic growth, but I just wanted to point that out.
I'd like to also add, if I can, we're hyper stressed because now our cortisol level is lower than the generation before. So we can't deal with stress. That's why we're hyper stressed. The way you know, I don't know if any of us could have survived 200 years ago, you know, 100 years ago being slaves.
Well, so then there's the school of thought, Susan, that also says that through epigenetics, that generations get stronger and more resilient because that's being passed down too. So I wonder, that's interesting that you say that. I wonder if that is how that's interpreted by, or how we're acting out of that. Maybe it's kind of either or. I'm not quite sure. But in some of my studies, I've found that the generations to come grow more and more resilient, in that, you know, even in what we're dealing with right now, a part of what gives me hope in moving forward for the future is that we have somewhat of a redemptive narrative, and recognizing how resilient we've been over the years, and how we can get past this moment in time, although it is not just a moment, it's a buildup, you know, but we can continue and we can take action, and we can continue to fight for justice in order for there to be equality, and there is hope.
Yeah, and what you said, I'm sorry.
I don't want to cut you off, so just hold that, because to Amber's point, it's more of a question, but given the atrocities that we are experiencing now, but even at a heightened level, you know, trauma now has just really landed in our lap, you know, by watching George Floyd die before our very eyes. You know, families, parents are trying to struggle with how do they communicate to their kids within families, how do they have dialogue. Employers are scrambling with how do I address the stress and the anxiety that's happening. So, you know, at some point we'd like to hear, with trauma as an overarching theme, but because of the sort of racial injustice and the ancestral trauma that may be resurrected, you know, how can that be managed? Yeah, so that's the question. But you can either address that, but make sure, Kai, that you speak to what you wanted to speak to.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Michelle. So really quick to Amber's point, I think as far as that resiliency, I think that it does speak to the strength of us as people, our ability to heal and move forward. And I think also just now with services for therapy and mental health and being able to now communicate more and having safe spaces to go to talk about experiences. And so I think all of that helps one become stronger and in their healing journey. So I think that's a great point. And I think that now it's not kind of like you just have to bottle everything up inside, but there are spaces such as this where you can start to talk about your experience. And then Michelle, to your point, as far as just everything that's on the news, and just explaining this to the youth to try to help them to understand what is going on. And it's so hard because now we have this 24-hour news cycle, we have social media, you know, I get alerts to my phone every time a news story goes out. So it's just constantly being bombarded with news. So I think, and I have to do this for myself as well, to figure out at what point in the day do I just kind of shut down, where I just step away from social media, I step away from the news and just have some quiet time. In addition to that, I think what we're currently seeing play out in our country, I think this is an excellent time for parents to really have that honest conversation with their kids about race and about the history of this country, and that everyone here you know, had a totally different experience, how they arrived here and what they have faced while here. But I think within that story is that story of resiliency, right? So if you, speaking specifically to the African-American experience, yes, it was horrific how we came over here and the experiences that we've had. And, you know, what we currently see right now, this is continuous triggers. But the fact that we do create spaces for us to talk about racial trauma. We do have, you know, there's this huge push right now for mental health awareness in our community. And so I think that speaks to that resiliency in us that says, no, we still can heal. All is not lost. Like, we've been through a lot, but we as a community and as, and even outside of our community can come together, begin the healing process, and start having those hard conversations. But I think if we start the work at home, that will then branch out into our community and beyond. But we have to first start having those very difficult conversations with our family. And many times that can leave us feeling very vulnerable. But it's important to start to have those talks so that we can understand exactly what's going on, and then that allows us to show up in the world differently.
And Susan, so you can address this. You know, it's important and timely and essential for conversations to be had within the home environment, and yet this is now trickling into our work, whether we are employees, associates, whether we are managers of others, business owners. You know, the question that often is posed is, you know, how do we address it? Do we stay silent, or how do we foster, you know, these kind of conversations? Because from a work perspective, it is probably impacting productivity, performance, just their mental and emotional health. So can you speak on that a bit as well, Susan?
I can speak on the mental health aspect of it right now. And it's about, yes, just like Kai said, it's like being willing to open up, willing to learn about yourself, willing to open up dialogue, willing to open up an uncomfortable conversation, willing to learn. For instance, I spoke to you, Michele and Amber earlier, and you gave me great, suggestions of where I can learn more about your culture, because I was not taught it growing up as well. So, but as far as the employee situation right now, I mean, unfortunately, I know there's, most people are on the front line and it's difficult, and then there's who don't have any employment. I really can't answer that question, to be honest with you, Michele. I don't know much about how to deal with the employment. A lot of people are learning to become more creative and learning how to do different type of works. I mean, even you and Amber, before we could have met in person. Now we're learning to do virtual work. It's about becoming creative. When you're in a cocoon, when you're stuck in a certain way, either you learn to accept it or you make the change. And it's about trying to become creative. It's a great time to, when you're dealing with obstacles, you can look at it and cry, or you can say, let me get to the other side. Let me figure out how to do it. And that's creativity. And that creates new neural pathways. It creates great ways to become more creative, more way of, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but feel free to interrupt.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No,
I'll jump in for a sec.
Go ahead.
I'll just jump in for a sec just to say, and I don't know if it was I've had so many of these conversations in the last week, and they're so important. But one of the ways that it affects us at work, I think, is that we have so many times had to just show up and shove it.
Mm-hmm.
And although we have seen something so traumatic, or we've experienced such a loss, or our heart is in our stomachs because we can't take this anymore, we have had to show up and shove it and do the job and not address, something that could be as traumatic as it happening even within our own community. And of course it's affecting us, but there is what is so unique about what is happening right now is that everyone is affected, and we are not distracted by going to work because we're still in quarantine, most of us. And so where it could be back to normal, show up and act like everything's okay, this is so in our faces, like almost never before, or not for, we've dealt with this with Trayvon Martin, with the many, many names that I can say over the years, unfortunately, but this is really in our face. And I see a comment from Maya in our chat saying that feeling muzzled is how I feel about this. And I think that is a feeling, Maya, that a lot of people can relate to, but this is the time to take the muzzle off. This is the time where these conversations, as uncomfortable as they are being had, and these employers and these corporations are being held accountable, and our non-Black, non-colored sisters and brothers are being also asked to pull up, as they say, and do something about it. Even if it's not directly affecting you, it's affecting all of us as a culture and as human beings.
Yeah, to just open the mic up to Maya. Maya, is there anything that you want to express, or a question to kind of get some further support around, are you personally, not to put you on the spot, feeling muzzled and what to do?
Hello, everybody.
Maya.
I'm on my phone and the video is acting up. So yes, it's been an interesting experience. I'm an immigrant and I'm brown. And so one of the ways we talked about it, and when I was doing my studies, is I had the experience of becoming a person of color. In my country, I was not. So it's an interesting experience to be in a place where I experience racism, I understand it with lived experience, but I also feel that I don't know if I have the right to speak to it. And it's an interesting place to be, because intellectually I know, of course I do, but emotionally there's this sense of institutionally at least, I've been on furlough, and I'm looking at what the institution is doing, which is not much. And it feels like I cannot find the courage to speak up because I feel vulnerable, given my immigrant status. So that's where the feeling of muzzled comes from. I can talk about it with students and friends and colleagues, but institutionally, I've been feeling like if I dare to speak up, I'm going to be punished. So that's just the feeling I've been sitting with.
Yeah, Maya, because I can say I recall from our other calls that you speak up and speak very intelligently about matters that you are passionate about, and that I think, you know, when other people of color, non-Black people of color speak up, it really gives perspective to the experience of people of color. And instead of divisiveness of separating us, we start to understand each other more, instead of saying like, well, we're bad, but you're worse, or you're, you know, or judging or not having compassionate for each other's sides. It's very interesting for me to hear the stories. Michele and I, we have a friend in our WBA cohort that we're a part of, and she is an Indian woman, and so she has spoken up very passionately about what she's experienced, both her and her brother, which are very different because she's a woman of color and he's a male of color, and then also with their shades of how dark they are and how society views them and what they deal with, that helps them to really understand and relate more, where some person that could totally pass for white does not have the same relatedness. Michele, I would like to bounce that to you to speak to from a point of view at work, as your expertise in the workspace, and how that may show up at work. You're on mute.
Can you pose the question again so I can?
I think Maya brought up when she was speaking that she knows how to relate interpersonally, like with her peers, but in a workspace, she's feeling muzzled. And so I don't know, maybe just speaking to that, or any solutions or any suggestions or coaching that you may have with your expertise.
It's interesting because, this is a question that's being posed by a number of business owners and CEOs as well as employees. I'm just coming from my own perspective, my own point of view, individually, as well as, you know, a little bit of best practices as an executive coach. And my theory is, you know, the pain and the emotional strain that not only this current situation puts on us, but anything that may be happening in our family. It could be a family member who lost a loved one due to COVID, right? So this is the stuff that we, within a work environment, not only within our families, but within a work environment, have to feel free that we can be fully self-expressed. So if we're feeling it, speak to it. Speak to it. So, you know, again, not to put you on the spot, Maya, but it's, you know, you're one of my good friends, and my invitation to you would be take the muzzle off. And as an empath, knowing you and so many of us, it's oftentimes we don't know how to say it or how to pose it, or if we're going to offend. We've got to just, you know, take the filter away and speak from our heart. You know, that's the only way. The only detriment is silence, feeling that we, you know, won't be able to say it in the right way, or maybe that's not the right time. It's just speak it, just be fully self-expressed. And from a, you know, business or employer's perspective, it's sometimes just be open and receptive. You don't necessarily have to answer. You don't necessarily have to know exactly what to do. Sometimes the best healing is to be listening and being an open forum for allowing people to just kind of express what they're feeling. I mean, that's what ultimate empathy is. You know, listen to understand. It doesn't always mean listening to respond. And there may be things that you hear that are said that will cause actions to be taken and policies to be written and behaviors and cultures to be transformed. But ultimately, allowing ourselves to be fully self-expressed is part of the healing. It's like letting steam out of a kettle. I mean, there's something about when we bottle it up, it stays in our body, and dis-ease creates disease. So, you know, it has a physiological impact when we can't express what's happening emotionally and put words to it. So, you know, I just say, when in doubt, spit it out, and allow, you know, and invite those conversations, however uncomfortable it might be. Yeah.
I'd like
Yes.
to add, if it's okay, one of the greatest ways, if listen, most women in general, and then certain cultures, they tell us women to be quiet, right? That's our place, to follow the man. That's the culture growing up with us. So to be able to speak out is fear. It's all fear-based, and you're afraid of how people are going to react. You're afraid of being judged. You're afraid of how people, you know, what's going to happen, and that keeps us quiet. The best way to start, you know, talking is journaling, drawing, anything that is creative. Get it out without judgment, and so you can get your thoughts, you know, on paper. And once you get it down, it becomes your own words. So now that you express from your heart and your wisdom, and you're able to express. Once you're able to express yourself, you're not so much fearful. But it's about being able to empower yourself and not to be afraid to speak up and find the words you really need to say, and not worried about being judged. Because everybody, you know, when we judge people, it's a perception of ourselves. Right. So if we say something, whatever, how they respond is a perception of themselves and their issues.
Yeah. Yeah. To that point, actually, I'd like to address a comment in the one of the comments that we have from Desi, one of our regulars. Desi, it's always great to have you. If you don't mind taking your camera, putting your camera on, you said that so many non-African American communities of color reinforce racism in their own communities, and that it's difficult to find solidarity with South Asian and Latino communities. So a part of the reason that I thought we thought it would be such a dynamic conversation to have both Susan and Kai join us is because of them doing the same work in different communities. So I'd just like to address I'd like for Kai and Susan to address Desi's comments, and Desi also welcome you to speak back with them
Sure.
based on what you shared.
Do you want me to speak first, or would you like them to speak first?
I
And
only
then maybe they can respond to my comment.
context.
Yeah. So I feel like if we're in terms of trauma and sort of the emotionality of it, it's very difficult to understand that what we're really dealing with is patriarchy and class oppression. And many people will say, oh, but it's class, it's not race. Oh, but it's class, it's not this. Oh, and the problem is, it is largely a class issue that we deal with, but that class issue is largely informed by race. And so it wasn't very long ago when Jews and Italians and Irish people were not even considered white. But it is through that assimilation to whiteness where those communities have been able to prosper in ways that Black and brown people have not been able to. And so it is important to understand that, like, this proximity to whiteness is what seemingly creates less oppression. And so I don't want to get into the oppression Olympics by saying, oh, but we suffer more than, you know, but the reality is, if you are a Black-skinned person, the farther away from whiteness you are, the more you are oppressed. And that is why we oftentimes have such, I mean, if you look at India, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry of skin bleaching.
Yes.
And that's not, you know, that is not happening in a vacuum. That has everything to do with white supremacy and proximity to Blackness and oppression and moving further away from being in a class of people who are deeply oppressed. And so you almost feel gaslighted when you live, particularly if you live in a place like New York City that is so deeply culturally rich. You have all of these like cool like Latino folks who you hang out with. And so like everybody wants the rhythm, but nobody wants the blues. So everybody is cool and down and fly. I just watched a beautiful special that comedian Joe Coy did. He's half Filipino, half white. He wanted to go to the Philippines to really rep, you know, being a Filipino comedian. He wanted to make inroads for other Filipino comedians. And everyone who went up there spoke in this very African-American vernacular. You can tell they're very influenced by Black culture. They had hip hop dancers. He had DJs on the ones and twos. And so I thought it was beautiful that he was repping Filipino culture, but it was so clearly deeply influenced by Blackness. And so it's hard to think about how we move through with the level of solidarity when everyone wants to sort of culturally cherry pick their experiences around Blackness. And then when it comes down to really saying, hey, speak up, they're literally enforcing it and reinforcing it in their own communities. And I got long, I'm sorry.
No, thank you, Desi. You make a lot of points, and I love the way that you speak up. And I've spoken enough, so I'm going to actually leave that to Kai and to Susan to respond to.
I think thank you, Amber. I think that's a great point. And I think this is something that Michele has said, that this is a transformational time that we're in right now. So that means that every community has to do work, right? So that means the Hispanic community, the Asian community, like everyone has to go within their community and begin to look and say, okay, are we practicing systems that are unjust? Like we have to be honest and stop just looking at the outcomes. We have to get to the root causes. And until we do that, we're going to keep having this same conversation year after year after year until we get to the root cause and we begin to address the hard issues, which is racism, which is white supremacy. So in order for us to begin to fix our communities and begin to have honest dialogue, we have to agree that, okay, this is the root of the issue and addressing that. And if I could say, like, I do see like statues being taken down and all of this stuff, which is symbolically is nice, but if the core principles are not changing, then we're just going to have statues removed, but policies and laws the same. So we have to be honest about exactly the country that we're living in, and begin to have honest dialogue, which everyone's probably going to be uncomfortable. But yes, if you look at the health disparities, education disparities that exist in a community, it's always, the disparities always exist in the African American community. Why is that? There's constantly research papers that come out. It seems like every month there's a research paper that comes out that brings attention to disparities that exist. But after that research paper goes out, then what are we doing after that? It's because we don't want to address the race issue. And I think that if you have a country that was built on racism, then what does that mean if we start getting to the heart of the matter? What does that do to the country where everything was built on this type of belief system? And so that's a tough question, right? But again, as we have been saying, we are all resilient people. So that means that we can figure out solutions that work, but that does mean that everybody is going to have to start to do their own internal work. No one can kind of say, well, that's that community's problem, they can solve it. It's going to take a collective effort, because now we're looking at the whole structure in which this country was built. And I mean, that's a whole nother layer that we'll have to address. And that's a tough conversation, because everyone's experience here is different.
I think the rhetoric has to change. I think the stereotypes are there, and it still goes on, unfortunately. But I think the most important thing is about education. It's education, and it's not just your own, which I've learned. It's not just my own, about learning other cultures as well. Going to school, I was telling Michele and Amber earlier on, like, I didn't have the education of Black history as much as I would have liked to have had to understand what they're going through, what all of people of color are going through. And I wish I had that education, so I would stood up maybe earlier than today. From my cultural background too, it's just about, we had gone around, there was a woman that went around and she interviewed college students, asked them questions related to the Holocaust, and so many children had no information about even who Hitler was, forget about anything else. And that's because Holocaust studies are not mandatory across the country, except for maybe 4 or 5 states. So I think we need to start creating mandatory studies in different cultures so people learn to understand each other's cultures and create dialogue like we are doing today. Understanding, having that heart-to-heart conversation, understanding why people of other cultures act a certain way. Why do they behave a certain way? And I think in the end, we all understand, like, we all have similar backgrounds if we're willing to be open about it and understanding. And the healing process is becoming aware and making the change.
You raise a really good point. You know, as this time flies, Amber and I always are so surprised when we look up and it's 20 past the hour. So as we are looking to bring about a bit of healthy transformation, you know, I think incredibly traumatic history and current situations are part of our life's journey. But as we're having this conversation about ancestral trauma and trauma in general, what can we begin to do, or how can we begin to be mindful of addressing it so that we can further perpetuate the healing process? Because, right, I love what you both have said, but particularly Kai, we are more resilient than we may be given ourselves credit for, right? So we don't want to deny the pain. We don't want to suppress the anxiety, but the question is, you know, what could we be doing so that it begins to shift the cycle and make us even more, or foster more resiliency? Any one of you that want to address that?
The one thing about epigenetics, right? If we are put in hostile environments and it affects us emotionally, mentally, and physically in a negative way, we need to put ourselves in a more positive environment, and so we can shift it again, become more a positive person. So finding peace within, finding calmness within, putting yourself in an environment that feels safer. So that could be with family, that could be with your girlfriends, that can start with starting with a therapist, you know, healing groups or whatever, just to go into this positive atmosphere. Because from within, the first thing you need to do is kindness. Be kind to yourself. Love and respect yourself, because when you love and respect yourself, people start loving and respecting you, and you share kindness and share education and so forth. That's just the beginning.
So I agree with that. Definitely extending grace to yourself, especially during this time. I mean, I think everyone is trying to figure out how to cope and how to deal. And if I could just share 2 books that have been helpful for me on my journey, and maybe the listeners and viewers, like, this could be beneficial to them too. So one book that we had discussed before is by Dr. Joy DeGruy, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. This book really helped me understand not only the history of African Americans, but actually how that history connects to trauma. Because a lot of times we know what happened, but we don't say, wow, like, seeing someone, you know, these atrocities happen, how did that impact their day-to-day? How did that impact them mentally and emotionally? And so this is a tough read, but I highly recommend this book. I think it's super helpful to understand. And Dr. Joy DeGruy, if you follow her on Facebook, she does do like live Wednesday sessions all around this topic. And another book that has been helpful for me is It Didn't Start With You. This book is great because it has exercises in it that you can go through to begin to see what have you inherited from your grandparents, from mom, from dad. And so the exercises, I mean, healing work isn't always fun, but it's so interesting what comes out of the different exercises and how you can begin to heal. So these are 2 books that have been helpful for me on my journey to really understand how trauma is transferred from one generation to the next, and how to begin your healing process. But as Susan said, I think the big thing is really to be kind to yourself, be patient with yourself, because the healing is work. You never arrive. It's a continuous journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I just posted, it's, that famous quote by Mahatma Gandhi, and that's be the change, right? So there's our own internal work, but then the mindfulness is what role can I be playing?
Mhm.
Who can I be being? How can I be showing up? That brings about a more kind of healthy environment. Even if I am faced with family members who don't understand, neighbors who may not understand my plight, employer or cultural situations, it's what is my role to do? There's the do and then there's the be. So yeah, I totally agree, Susan, with, surround yourself with sort of the positive forces, and yet we want to also not succumb to negativity and doubt as best we can. We want to counteract that with, who can I be? How can I be showing up? We are only responsible for the way we react to situations, right? So I think that also contributes to how we can kind of heal ourselves and basically heal the planet, which is what we're up to. Amber.
Yeah, I wish we had more time on this, but I'll just say in response to that when psychology and looking at what makes up our set point or what makes up our level of happiness and well-being that we come into the world with, it is that of our genetics, and then, as Susan mentioned, our environment, which they rank at about 10%, genetics at about 50%, and the other 40% is what we actively do, our intention. And so in order to have the redemptive narrative that I spoke about before, I think that, or I feel that these situations where we are not silencing ourselves, not isolating ourselves, and that we're connecting and that we are working on coming up with solutions is the best way to experience post-traumatic growth. When we are learning to be more compassionate, and also when we're learning to forgive. And I know that that's a tough pill to swallow, especially when we're suffering from that trauma, that chronic trauma that just keeps happening over and over. But in any experience in moving forward, there has to be some level of forgiving of ourselves and of others, which can be very hard to do. But even if it just starts with a thought of, I think some of forgiving right now that might be an easiest pill to swallow would be not prejudging or blanketing people together, and recognizing that just because one person is one way, that doesn't mean that everyone is that way that they represent. So I just wanted to mention before we close that I'm doing a webinar, a summit, a live discussion on Friday called Thriving While Black. And Kai, you spoke earlier about talking to our children, how we talk to our children about all of what's going on. And so Thriving While Black is a discussion about race, resilience, and how to thrive no matter what, despite it all. And you can visit my website to find out more about that. And everyone who's on here should know my website from our emails. But it's also a bit.ly link, bit.ly/Thriving While Black in all caps. And so I welcome any of you to join us. We have some really great guests this Friday as well.
One other thing, as Amber closes this out, respectively, she and I will be, we're individually sort of collecting reference material, resource material, books, videos, articles, right? Because this is the time to immerse ourselves in education. And, it's not just a Black thing, it's just with whatever is going to help us heal. So, we want to be a resource to provide some reference material of things that have been suggested to us, things that we've read and seen and has been impactful. So we'll be making that available on our respective websites within several days.
Including this great book, Through Our Own Eyes. You'll see more about this, but this is a journey into African-American history, and this is a great one. This is my daughter's summer curriculum, and I'll be doing it with her. So Kai and Susan, we just really, from the bottom of our hearts, want to thank you for coming and helping us to continue to bring such value and safe spaces to our communities. This is not always a discussion that's so easy to have, but we learn so much even in preparing for the discussions, right? I wish you guys could get some behind the scenes with us sometimes because, I'll just say, Susan, we talked about, Susan watched 13 before all of this and got more context to the African American experience, and it broadened her perspective. And I just really celebrate that you took the time to go and watch not just 13, but also Dr. Joy DeGruy's videos on YouTube and some other things that you watched as well. And this is such the time for that. And I know that both you and Kai are such powerful voices in your communities, and I'm glad that we were able to have this conversation with you. And Michele and I would be happy to address your communities as well. So feel free to call us up to be featured in your spaces. So next week, guys, we're going to be doing the vision board. We're going to be doing some vision boarding, which is going to be really exciting. We're going to start with asking you to prepare and cut out, if you're going to join us next week, cut out some of the pictures that you'd like to bring, because we'll only have an hour together. But this is a vision about what we envision beyond quarantine. Now that we've had this time to reset, what do we want our lives to look like a year from now? What do we want to come out of this saying that we've accomplished or that we've done? Or even if that's just rest, you can be on your vision board in a bed resting. That's fine too. This is a no judgment zone. But we'll welcome you to come and to do vision boards with us next week. That was at the request of one of our guests. And so we are so grateful for your requests that you give us. And we do take them into consideration. So please feel free to register for next week and come with your pictures cut out, and we'll be explaining to you how to manifest your vision. We'll have a dialogue around that, and Michele and I will share some of our suggestions and expertise, I guess, if you will, in working with clients and the power that we've seen in visions. So Kai and Susan, do you want to tell people where they can find you? We'll share it, of course, but how can everyone find you? Before we cut out, I just want to make sure that we know, Kai, to listen to your podcast, and Susan, how to find you.
Sure, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to?
No, I was offering it to you. Go first.
Thank you. So again, thank you, Amber. Thank you, Michele. Pleasure to be here with you all today. You can go to my website, kaimarie.com, and that's where you can get all the information about services offered. My podcast, again, is The Healing Element, and new episodes drop every Wednesday at 10 a.m. It is a weekly podcast, again, that centers around historical and generational trauma.
And you can reach me you can email me at artmenshearts@gmail.com. My website is Art Men's Hearts, and my social medias are Art Men's Hearts. I'll put that here. You can also listen to me. I do a carpool coaching with my partner, Jackie Atchison, Thursday Thoughts at 3, Facebook Live, and we have a YouTube channel, as well as I'm a co-host of a table talk called Live with the Vibe, where we are 4 women of different coaching backgrounds, and we have that heart-to-heart conversations. And you can see that at Live with the Vibe, YouTube.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. I love that name, Live with the Vibe. Michele, we can always find Michele at intoactioncoaching.com. That's into, INTU, actioncoaching.com. And you can find more about me at quartzwellnesscollective.com. That's QUARTZ, wellnesscollective.com. And so thank you, everyone, for joining us. This has been phenomenal. We really enjoy these conversations with you. I wish we could have addressed all of the comments in the chats. If you're joining us on Facebook, in order to interact with us, you got to sign up for the webinars. You got to actually click on the link and sign up, but we're glad that you all are joining us from Facebook as well. So thank you.
And one thing I just want to add, not to cut you off, is to anyone who wishes to revisit this conversation, as well as any of the other Lunch and Learn series that we've done, all of them have been recorded, and they're all posted on our respective websites. Sorry, Amber.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that. Yes, yes, yes. We don't want to leave that out. We are on our 13th episode, and so you can catch the recordings of the past ones on our websites. And that's also where you can donate if you feel so encouraged to do so. Like we say, we do this from the kindness of our hearts, but we do also accept donations. It helps to keep the world going round, or at least our world's going round. But no matter what, we'll be here on a weekly basis. As long as you show up, we're showing up. So thank you again for joining us this week, everyone. Be blessed, be well, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.